Hey, Newbie Dan here, and I'm going to show you how to use your drill press for sanding. I posted a version of this video earlier, but a couple of viewers pointed out a potential problem with it, so I decided to delete it. Then, with the help of said viewers, I came up with a potential solution, built a prototype, built a production version, shot additional video, recorded additional audio, cobbled it all together with the existing video, and uploaded it. You're watching the result right now. So stick around and see what all the hubbub was about. There's lots of useful sanding tools available. I use my belt and disc sander a lot. If I had a spindle sander, I'm sure I'd use that a lot also. But did you know you can sand things using your drill press? You can sand curved surfaces, like the rounded corners of the handle for the fence on this crosscut sled, or even the inside portion of the handle. You can also sand straight surfaces, although it takes a little more finesse. Here's how. This is a set of sanding drums I got from Amazon. You can find sets for less than $20, and even some less than $10. Each one has a shaft like a regular drill bit, with a drum on the end with sandpaper on it. And of course, you can replace the sandpaper easily. Drill presses are designed primarily to handle vertical forces. And this makes sense, of course, because you're applying downward pressure when you drill things. When you use a sanding drum, you apply horizontal force as you push against the spinning drum. Some types of drill presses aren't equipped to handle this, so using sanding drums could possibly damage them. Other types of drill presses may be just fine. For instance, Craftsman says my model of drill press works with sanding drums. But if you're worried you could damage your drill press, I've got a technique that should help. The trick is to support the bottom of the drum to help stabilize it when you push on it. It's actually pretty easy to do. But more on that later. For now, just keep watching. The first thing you have to do is get the setup correct. Set your drill press to its fastest speed. Then pick the right sanding drum. The larger ones are good for sanding straight surfaces, or gradual curves, or curves with a larger radius. They also remove more wood at one time, because the surface actually spins faster than the smaller drums. The smaller drums are great for tighter curves. I'm going to use the large one. Clamp down a couple of boards on your drill press table like this. You'll be setting your stock on these boards to keep it stable and square. They also raise up the stock so it'll hit the surface of the sanding drum. With thinner stock, each time you use a drum, you'll want to vary where the stock hits the sandpaper so you don't wear down one spot. I cut out a couple of push sticks on my bandsaw. Here's one of them. I intentionally cut way outside the lines here, just for demonstration purposes. Sanding this down is very easy to do, but there's some tips and tricks that help. The biggest one is to be aware of how much pressure you're putting on the stock, pushing it into the sanding drum. If you push hard, you'll sand off a lot very quickly. Sometimes that's good, but be careful, because it doesn't take much to end up with an uneven surface. Also, don't stay in one spot too long for the same reasons. As I get closer to the line, I back the pressure off quite a bit just to be sure. This is important to learn because until you get the hang of it, it's easy to sand too much off by accident. With a little practice though, it's really easy. The drum is spinning this direction, and I often find it's easier to move the stock backwards against the direction the drum is spinning, at least at the start. Then I'll move it back and forth. I've reached the big curve, and you can see how nicely this drum fits the curve. Now let's do the handle. All in all, it was pretty easy. When I'm done, I usually clean off the sanding drum with this abrasive cleaning stick. Here's another example. A while back, I made this crosscut sled fence, and I shot video of it because I thought it might come in handy one day. So I started with 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood glued together. I used a hole saw to cut these holes, so I'd have nice rounded corners for the handle. Then I marked where to cut to remove the excess. I used my table saw to cut off the excess. I could have done all this with my bandsaw, but at the time I had just bought it, and I wasn't ready to tackle cutting wood this thick with it just yet. All in all, it worked pretty well, but as you can see, the rounded corners needed some cleaning up. So I set up my drill press to use a sanding drum to do the cleanup. I had already set the drill press to its highest speed settings, so I started sanding. And you can see one disadvantage of using sanding drums versus a spindle sander. I had to keep pulling the stock away from the drill press so I could see how well I was doing. With a spindle sander, it'd be a lot easier to see because you can look directly down on it. Here's an example of using the sanding drum to sand a straight portion. It works fine as long as you pay attention. I sanded the rounded corners until they were smooth enough for my liking. Then, of course, I cleaned the sanding drum. I could have done a better job, but this was good enough for me. Now on to the inside of the handle. I used a Forstner bit to cut the inside of the handle, and you can see that it needs some sanding also. This time I used a smaller diameter sanding drum. I positioned the fence with the drum inside the handle and raised it up on the scrap pieces. Then I sanded. As you can see, it worked pretty well, but I could have done a better job. It's good enough for me, though. As I said at the start of the video, some drill presses might be susceptible to damage when you apply pressure to the sanding drum from the side. And, as I also said at the start of the video, with the help of a couple of viewers, I have a solution. Thanks, guys! Here's a quick overview, then I'll get into the details. I put a bearing on the end of the sanding drum. I'm also using a different bolt than what came with the sanding drum. I'm not too worried about the threads affecting the jaws of my drill press, but if it worries you, you can grind the threads off the top portion of the bolt. I made this jig for my drill press table. It has what is basically a large counterbore hole. The outer hole is big enough for the drum to fit in, and the inner hole is the size of the bearing. I raise the table up so the bearing is down in the hole, and then tighten everything down. Now when I sand something, the bottom of the drum is supported to help handle the side pressure. With this added support, the chances of damaging your drill press are greatly reduced. Nothing is guaranteed and I make no promises, but this should certainly help. Here's the details. Let's take a look at how I added bearings to the sanding drums. Your sanding drums may be different from mine, but you can probably adapt this technique to most sanding drums. There's a link in the description for these drums, but let me warn you. For some unknown reason, I bought a fairly pricey set of sanding drums. I have no idea why. They appear to be similar to the less expensive ones. So feel free to try this technique with cheaper drums. Let me know in the comments what you find out. I have these skateboard bearings left over from when I built my ceiling-mounted camera dolly. They have an 8mm hole, which is perfect for this application. I'll link them in the description, but these are fairly expensive. There's much cheaper bearings that I'm sure will work, and I'll link them also. The bolts in my sanding drums aren't quite long enough to add a bearing to, so I'll replace them with longer bolts. All my sanding drums use a bolt that is either 8mm or 5/16 of an inch. I'm not sure which. You can use either 8mm or 5/16 of an inch bolts, whichever you get your hands on. The reason I'm not certain of the original bolt size is that they're reverse threaded so the nut doesn't come loose while sanding, and I have nothing to compare them to. When you loosen the nut, you can take the sandpaper spool off. So how does this nut keep the spool from coming off in the first place? Turns out, as you tighten this nut down, it squeezes the rubber drum, and that causes the drum to expand outward a little. And that's enough to keep the spool in place. Gotta love physics. Anyway, as I said, I'm replacing the bolts. I'm using 5/16 inch bolts, 4 inches long. They're not reverse threaded, but I'll just use 2 nuts to hold them down. Now let's take a look at the bearing. Obviously the outside part spins, but the inside part doesn't spin. So we need washers that fit over the inside part, but don't reach the outer edge. I'm using 5/16 inch washers, and they're about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So I put a washer on the bolt, then the bearing, then another washer. Check to make sure the washers don't cover the outside edge of the bearing. Depending on the size of the drum, you might want to add a bigger washer next on top of the smaller washer. Then put the drum on, followed by its washer, then one nut. Tighten it down enough that the sandpaper doesn't move around. Then add a second nut. When you get it down to the first nut, put a wrench on the first nut to hold it in place and tighten down the second nut. Double check to make sure the sandpaper is still tight. Also, double check to make sure the bearing still spins freely. Now for the support jig. You can make this any dimensions you want. Obviously, I can only show you what I did for my setup. The one thing I struggled with initially was how to make a counterbore hole this size. I don't have a Forstner bit big enough for the counterbore. However, I do have a hole saw big enough, so I decided to use 2 boards. I used the hole saw on the top board. I used a Forstner bit on the bottom board, although any bit of the right size will work. Sandwiched them together, and voila, a counterbore hole. I'll start off by attaching the jig to my drill press table using these slots. I've got a scrap piece of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood that fits nicely over my drill press table. I'm also using a scrap piece of 1/2 inch Baltic birch plywood the same size for the top board. I take the 1/2 inch board and mark where the slots are. I'm going to use 2 1/4 inch carriage bolts to hold the jig to the drill press table, so I'm marking where to drill the holes. I used a 3/4 inch Forstner bit to drill 2 counterbore holes deep enough for the head of the carriage bolts. I didn't realize my massive forearms were going to block the camera. Oops. Unfortunately, I didn't check the footage until I was done, so we're just going to have to live with it. I put the 1/2 inch board on top of the 3/4 inch board and drilled the 1/4 inch holes through both boards. The carriage bolts fit nicely. I'm going to be using a couple of knobs I made to clamp the jig to the drill press table. I start with a square piece of whatever kind of wood I want. This is pine. I'm going to use this 1/4 inch threaded insert. This is the kind with the flange on the top. I mark the center of the square and drill a 5/18 inch hole. If you use hardwood, you might need to make it 11/16 of an inch. Then I use a 6mm hex key to screw it into the hole. I take the square over to the belt and disc sander, sand off the corners, and round over the edges a little. You could also cut off the corners with a saw of some kind. There you go, one threaded knob. I put a carriage bolt in the board and tighten down the knob enough to pull the carriage bolt down into the wood, and I do the same for the other side. I'm going to use this board to go under the drill press table to act as a clamp, so I mark where to drill the holes and drill 5/16 inch holes. I know I'm using a 1/4 inch bolt, but this gives enough leeway to easily attach the board. And here's how it works. I could probably add some epoxy to the head of the carriage bolts to make it easier to start threading the knobs, but I want to be able to remove them, so I'll just have to learn to be more coordinated. Good luck with that. After positioning the board where I want it and securing it down, I drill a small pilot hole through both boards. I clamp down a backing board, and using the pilot hole as a guide, I drill a 5/16 inch hole in the bottom 3/4 inch board using a Forstner bit, because that's the only bit I have in that size. Oftentimes when drilling holes like this, I'll drill partway through from one side, then flip the board over and finish from the other side. But I don't do it this time because I want the hole to be as exact as possible so the bearing has a nice fit, hence the backing board. And you can see that the bearing fits pretty good. It's not too tight, just about right. Now I use a hole saw larger than my largest drum, which ends up being my 1 3/4 inch hole saw, and cut the hole in the top 1/2 inch board. Again, I use the pilot hole as a guide. I drill partway through from one side and finish from the other side. This hole doesn't need to be as exact as the hole for the bearing. Time to try it out. I attach the jig to the drill press table, but don't tighten it down completely. I raise up the table until the bearing goes down into the hole. Then I run the drill for a second to let it settle the jig into place. Then I tighten everything down. Ready to sand. And there you go. Works perfectly. Regardless of whether my drill press is theoretically designed to use sanding drums or not, I'll be using this all the time. For one thing, I don't have to bother with raising the stock up enough to hit the surface of the drum, like in the method I showed earlier. And when I've worn out one end of the sandpaper on the sanding drum, I'll just remove the spool, flip it over, and start using the other end. Piece of cake. Using sanding drums with a drill press can work fairly well. On the other hand, the disc portion of my belt and disc sander is great for sanding surfaces down flat. So is the belt portion, and since it can be raised up, it can even do certain curves. An oscillating spindle sander is open on the top, so nothing gets in the way when you move your stock around. It's easier to stand over and look down on your stock to see how well you're doing. Since it oscillates, you get more even wear on the sandpaper and potentially smoother sanded surfaces. And since it's designed for pressure from the side, you don't have to worry about whether you're damaging your drill press or not. So in a perfect world, I'd have both of those. But if you, like me, don't live in that perfect world, this is an affordable alternative. There's links for sanding drums and other things seen in this video in the description below. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up and consider leaving a comment. Thanks! Check out the description for links to products seen in this video. Just scroll down, click Show More, and scroll down until you see the links. And if you like what I do here, click that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring that bell to get notified about new videos. Thanks!